1921, the wealthiest black neighborhood in America was bombed from the air by its own country. Not raided, not burned from the ground, bombed from private planes, while the National Guard stood in the streets below with rifles pointed at the residents trying to flee. Most Americans have never heard the name Greenwood, Oklahoma. That is not an accident. The story of what was built in that 35-square-block district and what was done to destroy it was kept out of national textbooks for nearly 80 years. Not because it wasn't significant, not because the records were lost, because the story was too dangerous to tell. When a community of Black Americans proves, beyond any reasonable doubt, that self-determination works, that wealth, infrastructure, and sovereignty can be built entirely outside of white economic systems, it does not simply become an inspiration. It becomes a threat. And threats, in America, are not preserved. They are erased. This is the story of Greenwood, of Black Wall Street, of what was built, what was burned, and what was buried afterward. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this story was the most dangerous idea in 20th century America. To understand Greenwood, you have to understand the world it was built inside. It is 1889. The federal government opens the Oklahoma Territory for settlement in a land run that will define the region for generations. Among those who staked claims were hundreds of formerly enslaved Black Americans and freed people of the 5 civilized tribes. People who had survived the Middle Passage, survived the plantation, survived Reconstruction, and were now, for the first time, claiming ground of their own. Reconstruction had officially ended in 1877. What followed was not healing. What followed was a systematic rollback of every political and economic gain Black Americans had made. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, resurgent and emboldened. By the early 1900s, the message was clear. You are not meant to own anything. And yet, in 1906, a man named O.W. Gurley, a Harvard-educated educator from Arkansas, purchased land in Tulsa's North Side and made a decision that would define the next century. He would only sell to Black buyers. Every lot, every parcel, the entire district, by design, would be Black-owned. What grew from that decision was something the country was not prepared for. By 1921, the Greenwood district contained over 300 Black-owned businesses. There were 2 newspapers, a post office, a savings bank, a library, over a dozen churches, 2 schools, a hospital, law offices, jewelry stores, hotels, a theater, Black doctors who performed surgeries, Black lawyers who argued in courts, Black architects who designed the buildings they worked in. The dollar circulated within the Greenwood community an estimated 36 to 100 times before leaving the district. Compare that to 1 or 2 times in many modern Black communities today. It was called, by Booker T. Washington on a visit in 1905, the Negro Wall Street of America. The name stuck, and the pride it represented went far beyond economics. Here was proof, living, documented, undeniable proof, that given land, given law, given the structural protections any free people require, Black Americans would build something extraordinary. That proof is precisely what made it dangerous. The economic architecture of Greenwood was not accidental. It was engineered. What O.W. Gurley started, J.B. Stratford expanded. Stratford, a lawyer and businessman, built the largest Black-owned hotel in the United States. The Stratford Hotel, a 54-room establishment that served as the social and commercial anchor of the district. There was A.J. Smitherman's Tulsa Star, a newspaper that did not simply report the news but argued, editorially and without apology, for Black political power and economic independence. There were the Spann sisters, the Williams family, the Jackson family, all building, all investing, all compounding. The question that must be asked, and rarely is, where did the capital come from? The answer is both simple and remarkable. It came from within, from the savings of educators and tradespeople, from the reinvestment of every dollar earned in the community back into the community, from a shared cultural understanding that individual prosperity meant nothing if the infrastructure around it could be dismantled. Greenwood was not just a place, it was a philosophy made physical. On May 30th, 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in downtown Tulsa. The elevator was operated by a white woman named Sarah Page. What happened in that elevator remains disputed to this day. Page never pressed charges. The encounter was likely as minor as an accidental stumble. But by the next morning, the Tulsa Tribune had printed a headline calling for his lynching. By nightfall on May 31st, thousands of white Tulsans had gathered outside the courthouse. Black residents of Greenwood, many of them World War I veterans who had fought for a country that still refused to protect them, came to defend Rowland. A confrontation broke out, and what followed was not a riot. What followed was a massacre. A coordinated, sustained, military-style assault on an entire civilian district. Private aircraft flew over Greenwood firing rifles and dropping incendiary devices onto the rooftops. On the ground, the Tulsa Police Department deputized civilians, some of the very men doing the attacking. The Oklahoma National Guard was activated, not to protect the residents of Greenwood, but to detain them. Thousands of black residents were marched at gunpoint to internment centers across the city. Their homes, left unguarded, were looted and burned. In less than 16 hours, 35 square blocks were reduced to rubble. Somewhere between 100 and 300 people were killed. The true number has never been established, in part because the investigation was never seriously pursued. Over 10,000 black residents were left homeless. 1,256 homes were destroyed. Every business on Greenwood Avenue was gone. And then, something happened that may be even harder to reckon with than the massacre itself. The survivors rebuilt. Within a year of the massacre, black residents of Greenwood had returned to their property and begun reconstruction. Despite insurance claims denied across the board. Despite city ordinances passed immediately after the massacre designed specifically to prevent rebuilding. Despite a government that investigated nothing and prosecuted no one. They rebuilt anyway. By the 1940s, Greenwood had re-established itself as a functioning commercial and residential district. Not to the scale of its peak, but alive, documented, defiant. The second destruction came in the 1960s, not from planes this time, from policy. Urban renewal, the federal program that sliced highways through black business districts across America, drove a section of Interstate 244 directly through the heart of Greenwood. What the mob could not permanently erase, the federal government quietly completed. Here is what economists have calculated about what was destroyed on June 1st, 1921. The property destroyed has been estimated at between $1.5 million and $2 million in 1921 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $27 to $30 million today. But that number misrepresents the true loss by an order of magnitude, because it does not account for compound growth. The businesses, the real estate, the institutional capital of Greenwood, had it been allowed to grow across the following century at even modest rates of return, would represent billions of dollars in generational wealth that does not exist today. Wealth that was never passed down. Businesses that were never inherited. Land that was never transferred. Professional networks that were severed in a single night and never fully restored. the descendants of Greenwood survivors, families who would today be the heirs to one of the most remarkable economic legacies in American history, are instead navigating a wealth gap that policymakers struggle to explain and political conversations rarely address with the precision it demands. The explanation is not complex. It was taken deliberately, systematically. And then the record of the taking was buried for 8 decades. The state of Oklahoma did not formally acknowledge the massacre in official educational materials until 1997. The first state commission to study reparations for the massacre survivors and their descendants issued its report in 2001. The survivors who testified before that commission, elderly men and women who had been children on the morning of June 1st, are now gone. They carried the memory of what was possible. They carried that memory for 80 years, while the country pretended it had never existed. If Black Wall Street had survived, if the capital had been allowed to compound, the institutions to mature, the land to appreciate across a full century of American economic growth, what would it look like today? Not just in Tulsa. In every city where a version of Greenwood once existed. Durham's Haiti district, Chicago's Bronzeville, Harlem at its height. Motown is next.
Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would it look like today? What should be done with what we now know? Next we go inside the most sophisticated marketing operation in American music history. A Detroit recording studio that didn't just sell records. It sold an entire culture on its own terms. To the whole world. Motown is next.